Hi, you're on the Nomadal Dreams channel. Today, I'll talk about the philosophy of pain, about how the thought of suffering becomes an instrument of knowledge, ethics, and social meaning. I'll explain the main ideas of this system and show why reasoning about pain is important for personal and public judgment. We'll unpack the questions that the very practice of undergoing pain poses to us, and how philosophy proposes to answer them. Say where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Write it in the comments. It's important for me to see the geography and time of day of those who listen. Take a deep breath. Notice your shoulders and the rhythm of your breathing. This is a simple anchor before thinking about difficult things. The philosophy of pain appears as a system of thinking about suffering that forms a theoretical framework for knowledge, morality, and social organization. It thinks in terms of functions and relations, through the role suffering plays in how we come to know the world, how we demand responsibility, and how we create communities. Its mode of thought is not abstract for the sake of abstraction. It's an analytical practice that chooses categories to describe sensitivity, guilt, the right to assistance, and social mechanisms for distributing harm. Thinking about pain remains relevant because suffering constantly involves the individual and the collective in decisions about what to consider just, what to protect, and what boundaries to recognize between people and institutions. At the core of this philosophy lies a set of interrelated focal points that form a coherent map. Pain as an epistemic signal, as ethical weight, as the language of community, the intentionality of pain, its influence on memory, aesthetic manifestations of suffering, the politics of distributing pain, the role of pain as a criterion of truth, the connection between pain and freedom, the boundaries of the subject, cultures of managing suffering, and processes of normalizing suffering. Each of these positions offers its own way of asking a question and receiving an answer. If by answer we mean a change in practice or in representation of what is considered acceptable and what requires intervention. Pain as an epistemic signal is viewed as the way the body and consciousness notify us of an existing threat or dysfunction. Such attention to pain translates it from the category of accidental suffering into information about the world. Pain as ethical weight acquires the force of a demand. It formulates obligations and claims, points to the responsibility of those who can help. Pain as the language of community means that the expression of suffering becomes a means of communication, capable of forming bonds, expectations, and solidarity. The intentionality of pain suggests that suffering is often directed toward something, toward action, toward recognition, toward changing a situation. Attention to memory notes how trauma and pain fix events in personal and collective history and change narratives about oneself. The aesthetic side of pain shows how suffering serves as a source of meaning in art and philosophical reflection, becoming a way to look at values. The political perspective studies the distribution of suffering as a resource of power. Who suffers? Who compensates? Which institutions reproduce or mitigate harm? The concept of pain as a criterion of truth applies the experience of harm as confirmation or refutation of beliefs and practices. The connection between pain and freedom raises the question of when suffering restricts autonomy and when it becomes a condition for genuine choice. The boundaries of the subject manifest through pain, defining where the I ends and how relations to others are formed. Cultural techniques for managing pain, therapy, rituals, disciplines, change the reception and expression of suffering and have their own philosophical consequences. The normalization of pain examines how habits and institutions turn suffering into part of everyday life and thereby conceal possibilities for transformation. Such a map serves not as a textbook of answers, but as a tool for posing questions. How do we become acquainted with the world through harm? Who owns the rights to help? Which signs should be considered confirmation of injustice? And where do the boundaries of personal responsibility and public protection run? Thinking about pain combines analytical precision and practical sensitivity. It seeks concepts that allow action in situations where words alone are insufficient, and pure empathy does not lead to institutional change. In this series of reflections, the key orientation is the transformation of suffering into a meaningful signal for reasoning and action. This does not diminish suffering or make it an abstract topic. On the contrary, the philosophy of pain aims to give experiences a form in which they can be heard and taken into account. At the same time, it points to the limits of such transformations, where language, institutions, and cultural practices are insufficient to make trauma visible and reproducible as an object of morality and politics. The first focus in such an analysis turns to the cognitive function of pain. This direction proposes to look at suffering as a message about the boundaries of the body and the world, as a signal that requires interpretation and response. It poses the fundamental question of what information pain brings and how that information organizes our actions, beliefs, and relations to others. The next idea will concentrate on clarifying this position. What precisely are the properties of pain that make it a source of knowledge? How the interpretation of suffering becomes a moral demand, and where gaps arise between sensation and social recognition. Pain is a signal of knowledge. It is not merely an unpleasant feeling. It is the way the body and consciousness report disruptions, ruptures between the familiar and the dangerous, boundaries that require attention and action. When damage or malfunction occurs, the sensation of pain directs attention and redistributes perceptual resources. The nervous system generates incoming data, but meaning in that data arises through interpretation. The sensation nudges towards searching for causes, checking the environment, and adjusting behavior. Such is the first function of pain as an epistemic indicator. It makes visible what otherwise would remain background. Through this visibility, beliefs about the state of the world and one's own capabilities change. Knowledge appears that is not reducible to thought alone, but is tied to action, to the necessity to do something, protect, or change. How this works in practice. The physiological side includes receptors, impulses, and reflexes, but the semantic processes include attention, memory, and expectation. The sensation prompts a check of habitual behavioral schemes and can produce an instant reconfiguration of plans and goals. At the level of thought, this appears as a change in beliefs about safety, available options, and priorities. The notion of risk and the boundary of one's own body are formed through repeated signals. A single episode of pain can become the beginning of a new belief about one's condition or a causal link between an event and harm. Sometimes, pain acts as a catalyst for scientific and everyday testing. The signal leads to an experiment. Change the position, stop the action, see a doctor, read information, ask for advice. The epistemic role manifests in the practical verification of hypotheses about the world. Socially, this means that experiencing pain can lead to a search for external confirmation and to a request for help. Here, an important transition appears from private sensation to public knowledge. What was experienced is subjected to verification, confirmation, or refutation through actions and evidence. The limit of this function is important in itself. A signal ceases to be reliable if it loses connection with the real threat, or if its interpretation is distorted. Chronic pain, phantom sensations, pain-related expectations, and cultural filters can disrupt the epistemic link. Habit, stigma, silence, or false beliefs can muffle the signal and render it useless as a source of knowledge. Where experience repeats without visible improvement, the pain signal becomes background that no longer triggers checking, and therefore no longer updates our pictures of the world. The threshold of sensitivity and the degree of trust in bodily indications depend on contexts and institutions that shape the perception of pain. Another limit is related to language and expression. When language is absent or unavailable, when pain cannot find a form for transmission, the signal remains private and does not become part of collective knowledge. If an experience cannot be described, if society lacks means of interpretation, suffering remains a momentary fact without consequences for representations of the world. This limitation shows that the epistemic power of pain requires channels of transmission, attention, trust, institutions that record and verify information about harm. Maurice Merleau-Ponty helps clarify what is happening here. His idea of the body as the primary way of knowing moves pain out of the realm of accidental phenomena and places it at the center of perceptions through which meaning is formed. Merleau-Ponty draws attention to the fact that perception is always embodied, and therefore the pain signal cannot be considered separately from the context of bodily being. It is precisely this bodily content that makes pain informative. It changes the mode of presence in the world and thus changes knowledge about the world. In the spirit of Merleau-Ponty, the experience of pain lacks a purely representational role. It transforms the subject itself as a bearer of information. At the same time, the philosopher points to the importance of distinguishing between experience and the language of experience. Merleau-Ponty emphasizes that a barrier always remains between feeling and its expression, and that understanding pain requires attention to how the body understands the world prior to verbalization. This suggests that the epistemic value of pain manifests already in the literal reconfiguration of experience, and only afterwards can be incorporated into the general system of knowledge through communication and institutional processing. So, to consider pain as an epistemic signal means to see in it a source of information about boundaries, threats, and possibilities for intervention. This function operates where sensations are translated into testable practices and into collective knowledge. It reaches its limits where the signal loses connection with reality, encounters silence, or faces entrenched ideas that ignore it. The link between body and meaning, which Maurice Merleau-Ponty highlights, remains a starting point for understanding how suffering becomes knowledge and where this process can be disrupted. This has practical consequences. To perceive pain as a signal of knowledge means changing clinical and social responses. Doctor and patient must jointly investigate the origin of the signal, relate it to the life context, and work on testing hypotheses. Society must provide language and institutions where pain testimonies are recorded, discussed, and affect decisions. This requires rethinking clinical ethics and educational practices. Listening does not mean tolerating harm. Listening means finding out and acting. In the scientific perspective, it is important to account for the fact that pain signals interact with cultural narratives and with institutional practices of recognition. Research should include qualitative methodologies, patient histories, and interdisciplinary analysis that help correlate individual sensation with social patterns and care policy. Only through such integration can we restore to pain its epistemic force, and build sound care practices that do not reject vulnerability, but turn it into a source of shared understanding and responsibility. This is the form of care. The problem is that the directionality of pain often remains invisible, although it structures all subsequent behavior and meaning. Pain is not just the presence of discomfort. It is addressed somewhere and to someone. It makes a demand for action, interpretation, or communication. When this demand is not registered, reactions look chaotic. Avoidance, fixation on the symptom, self-blame, or silence. Such vagueness impedes distinguishing cases where pain points to a specific threat from those where it functions as a signal of changing lifestyle or values. It is precisely this loss of addressivity that turns the experience into a source of doubt and mistaken decisions. The criterion by which one can recognize the structural directedness of pain consists of three interrelated signs. The first sign is intentionality in the sense of Franz Brentano. Pain is directed at an object or state that requires change. The second sign is the modality of action. Pain is accompanied by an impulse towards some type of behavior, be it protection, seeking help, or reflexive withdrawal. The third sign is semantic load, that is, the capacity of pain to form a hypothesis about cause and consequences. If these signs manifest, one can say that pain is structurally directed and not reducible to a simple background sensation. A short example will help grasp the point. You feel a sharp pain when a certain spot is touched. The impulse to pull your hand away and check that spot shows the directedness of pain and its pragmatic role. The consequences of recognizing pain's directedness as a fundamental property are broader than they might first appear. In the clinic, this means that examination should include a search for what the pain points to, not only measurement of intensity. Diagnosis becomes a process of interpretation where doctor and patient jointly construct hypotheses about the target object of pain. In ethics, this changes the allocation of responsibility. When pain clearly calls for intervention, its addressee bears the duty to respond, and this forms moral claims to assistance and protection. In politics, the directedness of pain becomes a resource for demands for institutional change. Collective sufferings that are directed at social injustice have the capacity to mobilize reforms. In philosophy, it is appropriate to revise the approach to suffering as a purely subjective experience, because directedness introduces an external content that makes suffering a source of knowledge about the world and the values operating within it. In aesthetics and culture, understanding directedness explains how suffering becomes meaning-making when it is directed at a story, idea, or image. The limit of this structure appears when the link between sensation and target object breaks down. Chronic pain often loses its directedness. It continues to exist without a clear cause and stops providing cues for action. Phantom pain retains the quality of intentionality, but the object becomes a non-existent body part. Cultural frames can redirect or muffle the pain signal, turning the demand into silence. When language is absent or community distrust prevents recognition, the addressee does not receive the call, and no response forms. The dependence between body and meaning is also disrupted under the influence of psychosocial factors that distort the interpretation of pain and produce erroneous explanations. This boundary has practical significance for distinguishing diagnostic and normative cases. Where directedness is clear, actions should be aimed at detecting the object and coordinating responses. Where directedness is lost, the task is different: to restore the connection between sensation and meaning, to help with language, diagnosis, and therapy align the signal and the object. In such cases, therapy's role is not only to eliminate the symptom, but also to reconstruct directedness, to find or create a context in which the pain becomes understandable and productive again. Thinking about pain ceases to be abstract and turns into the practice of specification. What questions does the pain pose? To whom are they addressed? And what checks are needed for the answer to be reliable? Philosophers help illuminate these transitions. Franz Brentano reminds us that intentionality is a basic characteristic of psychic phenomena and serves as a criterion for distinguishing oriented experience. Maurice Merleau-Ponty returns attention to the body as the primary medium of meaning and shows that the directedness of pain is woven into the manner of presence in the world. Emmanuel Levinas emphasizes the ethical form of address, where suffering constructs a demand upon the other. Friedrich Nietzsche points to the creative and transforming power of suffering, when pain releases new directions in will and values. These ideas help see that the directedness of pain is not only physiology, but a network of meanings and obligations. Ultimately, if you perceive pain as a powerful, orienting force, the question is no longer how to silence it faster, but whom and what it points to. Such a shift changes caregiving practices, political demands, and personal responsibility. It requires from us sensitivity to addressivity and a readiness to restore it where it has been lost. The mechanism by which pain becomes the basis of a moral claim consists of several linked links. First appears the pain sign itself, an expression of vulnerability that demonstrates the experience of harm. This sign is accompanied by communication, facial expression, words, bodily behavior, or silent suffering. Communication requires external recognition. Recognition records the fact that this signal is addressed to another or to society. Recognition triggers a normative reaction. The one who hears or sees the suffering receives an obligation to respond. Normativity is built on the fact of vulnerability and on the expectation of mutual care. Finally, the claim is formalized in social institutions, from family help to legal intervention, and gets channels for satisfaction. So, the mechanism is signal, communication, recognition, normative load, and institutional formalization. A brief takeaway from the mechanism structure. Pain by itself does not make a demand morally effective if it does not pass this path of communication and recognition. When the signal reaches the addressee and a norm reacts to it, a right to demand help appears. Why is such a mechanism needed? It serves as a distributor of responsibility in society. Through it, it is fixed who is in need and who should answer. Without the mechanism, requests for help would turn into chaotic wills to sympathy, rather than into a systemic claim.
The mechanism makes it possible to trust a complaint as a basis for actions and political demands. It allows private cases of suffering to be translated into general practices of rights protection and resource allocation rules. The mechanism's function also consists in checking the adequacy of a response. What help corresponds to the type of suffering? Who is competent to provide it? What preventive measures are appropriate? Here the connection between body and meaning
which Maurice Merleau-Ponty emphasized in his reflections on embodied experience, manifests. Understanding that the body speaks about the world helps form an adequate response. How this mechanism breaks down. The first path of breakdown is delegitimization of the sufferer's voice. When the structure of recognition is disrupted, the signal remains unanswered or is deemed insignificant. This state is described by the term testimonial injustice, introduced by Miranda Fricker. She shows how systemic prejudices make someone's pain less worthy of trust and thereby deprive them of the right to demand help. The second path is the normalization of pain, when institutions and everyday practices turn suffering into a habitual condition of life and exclude it from the field of response. The third path is the instrumentalization of suffering, when pain is used as a resource for others' goals, rather than perceived as the sufferer's own state. The fourth path is epistemic fragmentation, when the language for expressing pain is absent or distorted by medical and psychological labels that reduce the humanistic value of the claim. A chronic condition in which pain ceases to have a clear object also breaks the mechanism. The signal remains, but it loses touch with the demand and begins to generate doubt in potential responders. These kinds of breakdown have different consequences. Delegitimization reduces access to treatment, protection, and recognition as such. Normalization makes suffering invisible and cements social and economic inequalities in which some are forced to endure more. Instrumentalization turns a real need into a means of political pressure without an obligation to satisfy it. Epistemic discontinuity deprives society of the ability to properly assess the nature of harm and to select proportionate assistance. Through all these mechanisms, there emerges evidence of society's moral weakness. It stops responding to what once triggered an immediate obligation. What factors exacerbate the breakdowns? Power and status set the filters of recognition. The noise of power drowns out individual sufferers, and institutional interests tend to prefer manageable, easily measurable forms of pain. Economic logic evaluates suffering through the prism of costs and benefits, which leads to the reduction of claims to an accounting category. Cultural representations shape the language for expressing pain and the criteria of trust. If the prevailing narrative does not recognize a type of pain, its claim remains ungrounded. These processes intersect with the ideas advanced by Emmanuel Levinas about the face as the source of an indisputable ethical demand. When the face is ignored, the demand loses its primary status. Franz Brentano helped to show that the intentionality of experience is tied to what it points at. When that directedness is distorted, the moral claim loses clarity. The conclusion from all this is both practical and personal. If pain serves as a criterion of moral claim, then society needs to maintain mechanisms of recognition, develop an accurate language, and lower institutional barriers to expressing suffering. For you, this means being more attentive to how people around you react, noticing not only the intensity of pain, but its apparent aggressivity. Attitude towards suffering becomes a measure of social maturity. The better the mechanism that converts pain into a justified claim for help works, the more humane the network of mutual obligations. The role of philosophy here is not to create new rules of assistance, but to expose and describe the channels of recognition and normation that already operate, so that you can see where intervention is required and where restorative work is needed, to return a voice to those whom silence has deprived of the right to regard their pain as a basis for asking. How does power turn suffering into a manageable resource? And why does it need to do that? The politics of pain is a system of practices and meanings that distributes suffering across social fields so that it performs managerial functions. It makes suffering visible or invisible, endows it with the right to a response, or deprives it of that right, appropriates it into rhetoric of legitimation, or uses it as an instrument of discipline. This is not a metaphor, but a set of concrete techniques. Rules for accounting harm, procedures of recognition, norms of permissible coercion, frameworks of public attention. The mechanisms of this politics operate on several levels.
At the administrative level, laws and regulations determine which injuries are considered eligible for assistance and which remain a private matter. At the economic level, budgeting and insurance schemes translate suffering into monetary categories. At the symbolic level, media and official discourses decide whose pain is worthy of a poster and whose will remain a statistic. These three layers work together to create durable patterns of distribution. Powerful institutions direct resources where they consolidate their power, while vulnerable groups receive less support and have less voice. Michel Foucault analyzed the ways in which the state governs bodies and populations through discipline and biopower. His ideas help to see how the norm of health becomes an instrument of control. Illnesses are measured, classified, and incorporated into a system of surveillance, and boundaries of normality decide who deserves care. Karl Marx drew attention to the economic side of suffering. Through labor, exploitation, and social division, pain is redistributed between classes so that some endure the physical and social costs of production for the profit of others. Judith Butler has examined how political narratives render some lives more grievous and more entitled to sorrow than others. Her concepts of vulnerability and recognition show why the death and suffering of some become occasions for collective mourning, while others remain invisible. Hannah Arendt pointed out that the political sphere lives by recognizing one another as acting persons. When recognition disappears, suffering turns into a voiceless phenomenon that politics need not address. A brief everyday example helps to grasp the logic. If factory workers systematically sustain injuries, this may be perceived as an occupational hazard, whereas the same injuries in another group will immediately turn into a public scandal and a demand for reform. That shift is determined not only by the strength of argument, but by who holds bureaucratic and media levers. The cause, structure, and consequences of this politics form a coherent picture. The cause is the need to manage risks, maintain order, and preserve economic efficiency. The structure is the formalization of suffering through rules, accounting practices, and symbolic codes that select, mark, and attribute value to suffering. The consequences are the long-term legitimization of inequality, the loss of trust among those who regularly find themselves outside care, and the formation of collective identities based on differential access to sympathy and aid. This analytical core shows how state and private interests combine into a network in which suffering is redistributed so as to sustain existing relations of power. Within such mechanisms, there is room for deliberate instrumentalization. Suffering is used as collateral for patriotism, as proof of the correctness of repressive measures, or as a means of political pressure. Media frames, official rhetoric, and public rituals construct lists of worthy and unworthy victims. They create a moral geography in which some territories of suffering receive humanitarian aid and international attention, while others recede into the perennial background. This is done according to the logic of visibility and profitability. What is advantageous to power receives resources and recognition. I have seen how statistical standards and expert protocols turn individual pain into an abstract quantity, fit for plans and reports.
When pain becomes a reporting unit, it submits to management techniques and loses part of its personal claim. This is not merely bureaucratic harm, it is a change in the status of the sufferer. The subject whose experience is recognized gains a political face, while the other remains an object whose pain serves as background. The limits of political analysis of pain are also important. Politics explains much, but does not exhaust the depth of personal experience. There are surges of solidarity, sudden moral explosions that break the accepted map of values and force a reappraisal of attention distribution. There are forms of suffering so intense and extreme that they burst out of utilitarian calculations and provoke transformations of social norms. Politics cannot always predict these events, and philosophy in this field points to areas where analysis must acknowledge its incompleteness. For you, this means observing who receives recognition and who does not, and noticing the institutions that determine this. The politics of pain is not an abstraction. It is expressed in laws, budgets, headlines, and hospital admission rolls. Watching these mechanisms, asking questions of those who allocate resources, forming a voice where it has been taken away, means intervening in the order that consolidates the suffering of some for the comfort of others. The boundary of philosophical intervention here is clear. One can expose the logics of distribution, propose criteria of justice, but concrete transformations require practical steps in politics, law, and social institutions.
The consequence is stated immediately and plainly. When pain enters a person's history, it ceases to be a random episode and becomes one of the frameworks of their self. Suffering leaves marks on memory, on the way one speaks about oneself, on one's choice of surroundings and activities. Those who have endured chronic illness, degradation of relationships, or violence often construct their identity around these experiences. Pain provides a narrative, embeds causal lines into biography, makes some decisions understandable, and grants claims to care, attention, protection. This consequence appears in everyday life and in language. Bruises and losses explain actions, justify the refusal of former projects, and become arguments in disputes about who you are. As a result, the image of the I often turns out not to be a neutral map, but a map drawn by scars. Why this happens is a question of cause. The mechanism is complex and multi-layered. First, memory and neurobiology consolidate emotionally charged events more strongly and for longer. Chronic anxiety or repeated trauma forms the background against which attention and choice operate. Second, social practices fix these experiences into social roles. The name of a disease and diagnosis, the status of victim or survivor, become labels that others use in interaction. Third, narratives, personal and collective, give form to what was endured. The stories a person hears and tells about themselves order disparate impressions into a sequence of causes and effects.
Frantz Fanon wrote about how colonial violence shapes personal feelings of dignity and exile. Simone de Beauvoir drew attention to bodily experience as a source of understanding gendered selfhood. Michel Foucault showed how discourses and institutions ascribe roles and norms to the body. And Judith Butler studied how vulnerability and recognition become political mechanisms in identity formation. All these levels operate together and explain why suffering so readily enters the structure of personality. A clarification is needed so as not to reduce the topic to a simple mechanism. Suffering is not incorporated into identity automatically or uniformly. Some experiences remain episodes that do not change self-perception. Others become fixed only when there is a clutch of meanings and an audience capable of recognizing and naming them. Available words and cultural frames play a significant role. Where there is a ready language for naming trauma, where communities are prepared to acknowledge and share pain, identity can form through processing and integration. In the absence of words and recognition, the same pain becomes meaningless, is erased from the public field, and remains a private defect that does not crystallize into a role or a political demand. Moreover, the incorporation of suffering into the I does not always emancipate. Embedding pain into self-definition can provide resources for solidarity and rights to care, but it can also lock a person into a fixed position, making memory a source of repeated re-traumatization. The limits of this complexity show that the link between pain and identity requires attention to the contexts in which meaning is constructed. The tie to the philosophy of pain is clear and personal.
The philosophical perspective helps to discern which elements of your identity have roots in suffering, which societal categories amplify or shift those roots, and which ethical obligations arise from recognizing another's pain. For theoretical analysis, this means working with memory, language, and institutions, studying narratives and practices of recognition. For you, it means paying attention to which experiences you carry as part of the I, and how society responded to them, whether it supported, marked, silenced, or invested symbolic value in them. The philosophy of pain offers not only a diagnosis, but a criterion of evaluation. To what extent does your self-identification correspond to your autonomy and capacity for action? Does it not turn suffering into an eternal justificatory stamp? Or, on the contrary, does it deprive you of a resource for social recognition and solidarity? This also has political consequences. If collective practices and institutions grant rights and voices to those whose pain is recognized, then changing language and procedures can redraw the map of identities in society. Work toward justice includes creating conditions so that sufferings can be heard and processed into new meanings, rather than calcifying into routine roles. At the same time, caution is required. Turning pain into the main basis of identity makes it an object of political instrumentalization. And philosophy helps to distinguish where recognition serves liberation and where it becomes an instrument for entrenching new dependencies. Listening to your own story, pay attention to two directions. First, which events constitute the center of your biography and why they ended up there? Second, who confirms that centrality and what words they use to describe it? Whoever can recognize the origins of their identifications and see the institutional forces shaping these narrated lines gets a chance to change them. The philosophy of pain offers tools for such differentiation: analysis of language, institutional practices, and ethical obligations, and shows that work on identity through recognition and processing of suffering is simultaneously a personal and a social project. I will begin with a particular case as a mental cross-section of an institution. When in the healthcare system, patients' pain is tied to normative thresholds and documentation rituals, it ceases to be a signal of individual suffering and becomes a form of service. Complaints that do not fit into checklists are labeled chronic, psychogenic, or expected for the profession, and an algorithm of action corresponds to such a stigma. In this particular cross-section, pain has acquired the status of a system habit. Recurring suffering is coded, packaged, and translated into governing instructions that then operate without asking the person whose experience was the origin. This is not merely an administrative technique. It is a technological form of dealing with the body and time of life. From this particular case follows a generalization.
The normalization of suffering is a complex of procedures, linguistic rules, and distributions of attention that turn painful experience into a predictable unit of social practice. It encompasses medicine, labor regulations, educational practices, religious rituals, and family expectations. Each sphere offers its own capacities to describe and integrate pain. A medical protocol explains physiology. A labor regulation sets compensatory norms. Moral practices prescribe endurance or shame.
Michel Foucault analyzed similar mechanisms of transforming individual bodies into objects of management and showed how knowledge and power are tightly woven in the act of norming. Simone de Beauvoir drew attention to how social roles dictate expectations of bodily suffering within a broad network of gender prescriptions. Judith Butler helped to see that recognition of vulnerability and its public articulation is a political act that can either solidify status or reveal possibilities for solidarity. Altogether, normalization works as a technology for distributing attention and rights. Who receives sympathy, care, and compensation, and who is forced to endure pain as a condition of life. The mechanisms of this process are multi-layered. Language stamps the experience first. When a painful symptom receives a designation, it enters the field of possible responses. Bureaucratic procedures then sort cases and produce standard replies. Economic interests amplify the effect. It is cheaper to consider pain expected than to fund long-term treatment. Cultural narratives form moral evaluations of endurance and resilience. Elaine Scarry wrote that pain often shreds language, makes it hard to express. Normalization compensates for this initial loss of word, but at the same time absorbs the uniqueness of the experience into a general category. Altogether, these levels consolidate habitual responses and remove the creative impulse for changing institutional practice. The consequences are social and personal. At the social level, normalization builds a hierarchy of sufferings, where some kinds of pain are assigned lesser moral and legal weight. This makes exploitation possible. Workers' bodies serve the economy while remaining within the norm, and dominant discourses justify economizing on care. At the personal level, a person whose suffering has become the norm risks losing the language and the right to demand help. A recurring diagnosis as part of the job, old age weakness, or an expected outcome strips the subject of plaintiff status and turns their experience into background. Psychologically, this reinforces patterns of silence and adaptation to limitation, and politically, it reduces the number of declared cases of need and claims. Normalization also has less obvious functions. Sometimes, standards help to distribute limited resources, provide predictability, and reduce chaotic responding. Where there are standards, it is possible to plan care, train personnel, and create protocols that, under conditions of scarcity, work faster than individual addressing. Foucault emphasized that rationalization and normativity give institutions efficiency and manageability. Simone de Beauvoir reminded us that some cultural expectations, while constraining, simultaneously create space for collective practices of support. This generalization is important because normalization is not always simply a negative phenomenon. The theoretical and practical limitation stands immediately. First, normalization does not explain all forms of silence about pain. The merging of painfulness with routine depends on the history of power relations, symbolic resources, and the availability of language to describe suffering. Not every institution normalizes in the same way, and the same practice may in one context provide protection, while in another become a mechanism of suppression. Second, the philosophical framework of normalization itself does not dictate a political response.
Intervention requires understanding concrete networks of interests, material conditions, and cultural symbols. The analytical triad here appears as follows. The cause is linked to advantage and habit. The structure lies in language and rules. The consequences are reflected in rights and attention. It is important to observe the limits of this scheme so as not to reduce the problem to a banal formula. A practical thought follows from this limitation. You can start by observing which categories in your environment make pain expected. Look at documents, rituals of address, and the language of diagnosis. It becomes clear that change requires work with words, institutional procedures, and economic incentives. Revising normative thresholds, introducing practices of recognition, expanding linguistic categories for describing pain, and creating channels for individual stories can break the automatism of normalization and return pain to the category of things that require a responsive care. The philosophy of pain helps to see where habit has become an institution and where an institution has become an excuse for indifference, but it leaves space for practice where that observation is translated into changing rules and attentiveness. The rule is simple and at the same time deep. Pain functions as the language of community. When the body speaks of damage, it constitutes an utterance addressed not only to the sufferer, but to others. This utterance carries information about need, about violation of interactional rules, about the demand for attention, and about the fact that the previous order has been disrupted.
The language of pain includes sounds, gestures, medical terms, myths, silence, letters, and complaints and protocols. It creates meaning. Through it is communicated what happened, who is implicated, and what actions are expected. Recognition of this language is the first step toward making pain a social task rather than a solitary phenomenon in the body. How exactly pain reaches a listener and what kind of response it becomes is a complex and political question. Which codes translate moans into care and which into offense or suspicion? Understanding this requires attention to the context of expression. Pain takes on speech forms where there are stable practices of interpretation: family, hospital, neighborhood circle, court, media. Language formulates the grammar of rights to assistance and the attributes of respect. Elaine Scarry described that pain often destroys words, makes them brittle. Then the duties of translating another's suffering fall upon those who hear. Simone de Beauvoir pointed out that social roles predefine which expressions of suffering are considered permissible and which are unworthy of attention. That means the act of expression and the act of recognition are interdependent. One does not exist for long without the other. In this living field of exchange, simple human scenes are formed. In the room of the younger patient, neighbors come. Someone brings soup. Someone sits beside her in silence. Someone asks for the story in order to learn how to help. Online, a post with a photo from the hospital triggers a chain of messages, offers of assistance, criticism, and indifference. One short case shows the mechanisms. A human cry, heard and taken into hands, turns into a care plan. A cry left unanswered accumulates loneliness and despair. These micro-events accumulate meaning and fixed social expectations about how the community responds to suffering. Tension arises where the language of pain and the infrastructure of response diverge. On one hand, pain can be instrumentalized as evidence, as a demand for political mobilization, or as material for a public spectacle. On the other hand, signals are often distorted by bureaucracy, economics, and a culture of silence. Analytically, this can be laid out. The cost lies in distributed resources and power. The apparatus is represented by codes of interpretation and response procedures. The consequences are visible in who receives care and who remains outside of attention.
Michel Foucault showed how knowledge and power simultaneously shape practices of care and neglect. Judith Butler studied how recognition of vulnerability depends on political forms of acknowledgement and on whose suffering is deemed worthy of public response. These mechanisms create the risk of turning pain into a label, into an object of scrutiny, and then the language of pain ceases to be a sincere communication of need. How does the ethical component of this problem unfold? Transmitting pain into the public sphere imposes obligations. When someone reports suffering, the listener acquires a moral task: to understand, to accept, and to act. This demand of responsibility forms the fabric of social relations. Sometimes responsibility is expressed in concrete care, sometimes in political pressure on institutions, sometimes in silent presence. Simone de Beauvoir noted that expectations of mutual support and the conditions for its realization depend on how society distributes roles and rights. Recognition of pain transforms these distributions because it makes visible what previously was background givenness. Listening in this sense is not a passive mystical act, but a practical skill that requires tools of translation and means of recognition. Resolving the problem of the language of pain lies in practices of translation, recognition, and institutional adjustment. First, it is necessary to develop skills for translating bodily and mute suffering into understandable and actionable forms. Training medical workers, neighborhood networks, and institutional staff in attentive reading of expressions of pain, expanding vocabularies for describing experiences. Second, creating procedures that allow being heard without stigma and scrutiny. For example, channels for accounts of chronic conditions, formats for collective discussion of care and service issues. Third, forming public rituals of recognition where suffering is given a name and a place, rather than being hidden in statistics. Judith Butler pointed out that politics of recognition can grant an entity the right to visibility. Michel Foucault reminded that any procedures carry power within them, so mechanisms of oversight are required regarding how exactly the language of pain is used. A practical step is closer than it seems. You can start small. Notice what it means to be heard in your circle, which words close the distance and which push people away. Find out which institutions give shape to stories of suffering and which block such accounts. One line in a protocol, one training session for staff, one local meeting where people take turns telling about their ailments can change the rules of audibility. Elaine Scarry taught that returning the word to pain is an act of restoring human connection. The philosophy of pain here does not remain an abstract scheme. It offers a practice of attentive translation, where language serves as a linking element and the community as a field of responsibility. A common reaction to depicted pain is admiration of form while distancing from content. It feels as if the artist has lifted suffering out of the plane of personal grief and placed it in a frame where one can admire, analyze, and discuss it without engaging with the pain itself. At the same time, another intuition occurs. Art can make visible what would otherwise remain displaced by silence, and through form, open access to understanding suffering. The contrast between exalting form and restoring meaning lies at the foundation of aesthetic work with pain. In the aesthetic appropriation of pain, there is a technique of turning experience into an imagistic structure. Artistic form robs pain of its immediate bodily severity and gives it symbolic distance, allowing the experience to be related to other meanings. Arthur Schopenhauer considered suffering the central element of existence, and art for him served as a way of temporary withdrawal from the will and its torment. In this key, aesthetics offers relief through contemplation. Friedrich Nietzsche saw in tragic experience a power that reinterprets suffering as an element of life affirmation. Art here acts not as a refuge, but as a transformer of meaning.
One can describe these movements as working with the context of pain, highlighting details, creating symbolic connections, drawing out recurring motifs that help relate the personal to the collective. A short conclusion. Aesthetics changes relations to pain through form and semantic transformation. This is not a mechanical substitution. It is a procedure in which transformation is accompanied by losses and gains. The loss consists in the possible distancing from the sufferer. The gain in creating an accessible system of meaning that can expand public attention. How to assess the moral side of such transformations? The question of the ethics of aestheticization cannot be reduced to accusing the artist or the defender of art. There are ways of aesthetically addressing pain that amplify the voice of the sufferer, and ways that make them an object of contemplation. Georges Bataille was interested in the limits of experience and how extreme sensations move into the ritual sphere. His reflections help understand when aesthetics becomes an instrument of ecstasy and when it serves processing of trauma. Parallelly, Elaine Scarry pointed out that pain destroys language, and it is precisely this destruction that sets for aesthetics the difficult task of returning speech the power of description without exploiting another's muteness. Ethical analysis requires attention to how exactly the artistic form relates to the source of suffering. Does it preserve the other's existence as subjectivity, or does it turn them into a symbol for effect? Analyzing the mechanisms shows several persistent techniques. The first technique is representation through distancing, where pain is formatted as abstract metaphors, patterns, or rhythm. This technique gives the viewer space for contemplation, but easily slides into aesthetic distance. The second technique is direct explication. When trauma is laid out in detail, sometimes shocking, it creates strong empathy, but is associated with the risk of secondary traumatization or exploitation of affect. The third technique is inclusion of the sufferer's voice in the work, when talk about pain comes from within and when creativity serves as a means of expression, restoration of language, and agency. These techniques are not neutral. Each strategy forms certain relations between creator, witness, and the person who has experienced suffering. Summary. Aesthetic engagement with pain becomes socially and politically significant through medium, form, and the author's position. Artistic practices influence memory and public sensibility, set accessible interpretations and norms of empathy. When forms push society toward recognizing vulnerability and responsibility, aesthetics can serve the public good. When forms amplify sensation and harden distance, they support alienation and exploitation. An image helps grasp the distinction. I think of a work in which line and color hold attention like a taut string. The form itself seems to contain the moment of deterioration, not demonstrating it in naturalistic shock, yet not letting it disappear into symbolism. Such a technique preserves the density of experience while translating it into a language understandable to others. What matters is the artistic material that leaves room for the person's voice, rather than replacing it with a universal sign. The meaning philosophy extracts is that the aesthetics of pain is not merely a technique of beauty or device. It is a way to reinitialize experience in collective memory, to remember suffering without turning it into a commodity. Friedrich Nietzsche, Arthur Schopenhauer, Georges Bataille, and Elaine Scarry provide different keys to this problem, but they share the thought. Form can be both salvation and threat. It depends on the form whether suffering remains a subjective experience or becomes an object of manipulation. Fixation. Treat artistic handling of pain as a practice of translation, where the primary duty is to preserve the agency of the one who suffers and to give voice rather than exhibit the wound for effect. When you encounter a work, link your attention not to the effect, but to the question of who is given back a voice, what relations it forms, and what actions it provokes. This is the ethical measure of the aesthetics of pain, to evaluate form by its ability to sustain the presence of the other without depriving them of the right to their own narrative. Pain changes the structure of freedom. It narrows the range of available actions and at the same time can shift the scale of preferences so that new decisions become possible and meaningful. This statement is straightforward. Suffering affects possibilities of choice through the body, through memory, and through the meanings a person recognizes as important. Explaining this mechanism requires attention to three levels. At the bodily level, intense pain reduces the set of immediately available actions, changes temporal horizons, and diminishes the capacity for long-term planning. At the motivational level, chronic or recurrent suffering restructures the value system. Risks that were previously acceptable now seem unacceptable, and something previously insignificant becomes central to life. At the social level, pain enters a network of expectations and obligations. The role of the sufferer imposes demands on them that influence freedom of choice, and society's response, help, neglect, or control, modifies real possibilities. Taken together, these effects evenly and invisibly redistribute autonomy, not always drawing attention to it. A brief summary of this explanation in one sentence. Suffering acts as a filter of freedom that simultaneously restricts action and transforms motivation. Such a formulation clarifies that freedom here is not an abstract condition, but the result of a complex interaction of bodily constraints, psychological transformations, and social forms. What criteria allow judging when pain diminishes freedom and when it opens it? It is important to single out several detailed indicators. The first is the degree of control over choice. The ability to say enough and change course indicates preserved autonomy. The second is awareness and information. A choice based on clear understanding of consequences has a different status than a choice imposed by fear or despair. The third is the availability of alternatives. When pain forces one to choose between two equally harmful options, freedom is formal but not real. These criteria help distinguish cases in which suffering makes the agent a subject of action from cases where it turns them into an object of circumstances. At the level of the apparatus, the following happens. In the British and continental traditions, will is sometimes considered an independent capacity to act. But pain intervenes in its functioning through the organism's resources and through the narrative of the self. The mechanism can be described as a recalibration of priorities.
Energy is directed toward minimizing suffering, and projects that previously provided self-realization are postponed or lose value. The consequence of this recalibration is a change in life trajectories. The limits of this mechanism lie where pain is so intense that it suppresses the ability to reflect and choose, where the agent acts impulsively or automatically. This analysis shows the importance of distinguishing between temporary subordination to pain and long-term loss of autonomy. A figurative representation helps feel the difference between forms of dependence. When a person remains in a situation of pain due to lack of alternatives, freedom resembles a window with bars. Visibility is possible, but there is no exit. When pain serves as a pivot for new orientation, a refusal of former expectations, a search for other meanings, freedom resembles a door that opens but requires effort and risk. Both images contain will and its limits, the key parameter being the presence of real opportunities for changing the situation, rather than a symbolic illusion of choice. The boundaries of the argument are clear and important. Not every reaction to suffering should be seen as a manifestation of deep autonomy. Sometimes, adaptation to pain is simply survival rather than meaning-making. Nor should one ascribe to all experiences of suffering a uniformly positive effect on freedom. Prolonged deprivation of resources, social isolation, or systemic coercion undermine the capacity for free decisions. These limits require that judgments about freedom be contextual and attentive to the relation of power, information, and alternatives. Connection with the philosophical tradition helps refine the arguments and test their resonance. Arthur Schopenhauer viewed suffering as a deep attribute of the will, which continually draws towards satisfaction and therefore experiences constant deficits. In that key, pain is not just an obstacle to choice, but a structural background of human striving. Friedrich Nietzsche arrived at the idea that suffering can be a motor for evaluation of values and a source of creative power. From this perspective, restriction can become the beginning of new autonomy based on a different relation to oneself. Elaine Scarry pointed to the destruction of language in severe pain, and her observation reminds us that freedom is weakened when the capacity to articulate experience disappears. Restoration of speech and narrative becomes a condition for the return of autonomy. These names do not exhaust the topic, but show different aspects of the interaction of pain and freedom: the structure of the will, creative processing, and linguistic vulnerability. A final normative thought is simple and practical. When you evaluate a situation that links suffering and freedom, check three things. Does the person have real alternatives? Can they clearly express their motives? And are there external forces pushing or restricting the choice? These criteria allow distinguishing forced submission from freedom born of suffering that nonetheless preserves agency. Preservation of the possibility to refuse, preservation of the language of one's own experience, and the existence of social and material options, these are the ethical measures of freedom in the context of pain. The problem is that pain reconfigures the line separating the I from the external. This line is simultaneously physical, psychic, and social, and when suffering comes into play, the boundary becomes porous, torn, or shifted. It is not merely a signal of injury, but a reorganization of who the person appears to themselves and who they are seen to be by others. For you, this means that familiar markers of subjectivity, control over the body, a stable life story, the capacity to act, cease to function as reliable indicators of access to the person. Criteria by which one can judge the position of the boundary help translate the problem into an assessment. The first is bodily continuity, the ability to sense one's limits and control movements when the painful experience does not erase the distinction between body parts and the external environment. The second is narrative coherence, the possibility of holding a sequence of memories and intentions to speak of oneself as the same subject as yesterday. The third is communicative accessibility, the ability to articulate pain and be recognized in one's suffering by others enough that the experience is not completely isolated. The fourth is agentic orientation, the presence of goal-directed actions that originate from one's own intention rather than automatic reactions to injury. These criteria do not exist separately. They interact and provide distinguishable signs by which the boundary of the subject can be considered preserved or undermined. The consequences of boundary change are deep and multi-layered. On the individual level, blurring the boundary leads to fragmentation of experience and a sense of estrangement from one's own body.
When bodily continuity is disrupted, habitual ways of self-definition become unavailable. Memory breaks into segments between which bridges of meaning disappear. Narrative loses stability, and a person begins to perceive themselves as a set of experiences rather than a unified agent. On the social level, the shift of the boundary alters the status of claims for help and recognition. If suffering cannot be articulated or is not recognized, the subject loses the right to participate in collective practices of care and responsibility. Political institutions and everyday practices then dictate where and how boundaries are set. And these decisions affect the distribution of obligations, access to treatment, and legal protection. Psychological practice and medical ethics find themselves in a position where restoring the boundary becomes part of therapy. When the boundary blurs, the moral landscape of responsibility also changes. Where subjectivity is compressed, capacities to give consent, make decisions, and bear consequences shrink. This creates a situation in which the obligations of those around intensify. Recognizing pain as a threshold beyond which a person becomes vulnerable requires rethinking social roles and forms of assistance. Thinking about rights must take into account that the boundary of the subject is not an abstract drawing, but a living line threatened by chronic deprivation, violent intervention, and linguistic loss. In such circumstances, questions of freedom and duty cease to be a private dilemma and become a public matter. The boundary is theoretically and empirically limited. There are forms of pain and contexts in which the boundary remains relatively intact. Brief acute pain with preserved language and support does not break the narrative. It can be integrated into a personal history. There are others, long-lasting migraine, trauma, systemic violence, that destroy the structure of the subject gradually and persistently. Maurice Merleau-Ponty emphasized the significance of corporeality as the basis of consciousness, and his ideas help understand why disturbance of the felt body changes the very possibility of being a subject. Jean-Paul Sartre insisted that freedom manifests through a projective relation to the future. And when projectivity is blocked by painful experience, subjectivity loses one of its key pillars. Michel Foucault pointed out that institutions shape boundaries of the person through practices of knowledge and power. This explains why changes in the status of pain are reflected in legal and medical procedures. Elaine Scarry showed that severe pain destroys language, and the loss of words deprives a person of means to be heard. Figuratively, the boundary is like skin that simultaneously makes the world accessible and rejects it. This skin can harden, may become scarred, can grow transparent or be torn. When it is transparent, you continue to act as before, but world and body cease to be clearly separated. When it is torn,
the previous sequence of sensations and intentions ruptures, and it is no longer clear where you end and where the second body of suffering begins: the medical, legal, or symbolic. In such cases, restoring the boundary requires not only pain relief, but also a repair of the narrative, the return of language, and the reconfiguration of social ties. The boundary in Crescent also has a practical side. In work with people in pain, asserting the boundary becomes an ethical task. To acknowledge the fact of blurring without reducing the person to their suffering. To provide conditions for restoring the capacity to act and to speak. The word restoration here means creating material possibilities, social recognitions, and linguistic tools by which a person can again identify their self. Arthur Schopenhauer suggests that suffering is the constant background of the will, and this requires attention to the deep structures of motivation when restoring boundaries. Any attempt to regulate suffering must take into account that the subject's boundary is simultaneously a biological and a semantic line. A boundary that can be set as the limit of this reasoning is this: philosophy can describe signs of breakdown and offer criteria for evaluation, but it cannot unambiguously say where a personality ends in every particular case. Contexts differ, cultural practices differ, and what for one society is a sign of loss of subjectivity, for another turns out to be an acceptable transformation. For you, this means that assessment must be practical and attentive to detail. Check corporeality, narrative, communicative accessibility, and agency. And remember that restoring the boundary requires comprehensive work with the body, language, and social support. The mechanism that makes pain a boundary of the subject works through a coordinated chain of bodily signals, semantic fixations, and social responses. First, there is a sensory impulse that mobilizes attention and the body. Then, this impulse receives a name in language and is incorporated into a self-narrative. Finally, those around either confirm this story or reject it, and through their recognition, the boundary is strengthened or shifted.
At the bodily level, the boundary appears as a feeling of contour,
where my skin ends, where others' touches and threats begin. At the level of meaning, the boundary is held by a sequence of memories and plans that link the present to the past and the future. At the social level, the boundary exists in recognition. The phrase, "I hurt," becomes a request for protection, resources, or care only when someone has enough sensitivity and power to acknowledge it. A brief conclusion from the mechanism structure. Pain simultaneously marks vulnerability and asserts subjectivity because it requires a response. This response can be bodily, care, analgesia, protection, or symbolic, recognition, documentation, legal action. Maurice Merleau-Ponty helps to see how primary corporeality makes all subsequent levels possible. If the body ceases to be a foundation, words and rights slowly lose their footing. Why such a mechanism is needed? First, it serves a protective function. By quickly signaling damage, pain creates space for intervention and prevents further harm. Second, the mechanism provides agency, the ability to assess a situation and choose an action relies on the distinction mine, not mine. And pain makes this distinction explicit. Third, through language and recognition, the boundary becomes a basis for moral claims and social obligations. If your pain is visible and made sense of, you gain the right to care and to influence decisions that affect your life. This explains why the question of boundary is deeply political. It underlies who society gives resources to and whose suffering is left out of account. Where this mechanism breaks. There are several types of failures, each producing its own profile of damage. The first type is internal, chronic or unbearable pain that erases differences between life episodes and turns time into a continuous background of suffering. Here, narrative continuity is disrupted and projectivity disappears. The second type is linguistic. When pain is deprived of verbalization, words slip away and the person loses the ability to assert themselves in the usual form. The third type is institutional. Medical, legal, and bureaucratic practices can make suffering invisible or dubious, reduce its legal weight, or turn it into a diagnosis that strips rights. Michel Foucault shows how boundaries of humanity and the right to recognition are established through practices of knowledge and power. These practices often operate silently, so the mechanism's breakdown remains unnoticed. When pain remains without language and recognition, the person ceases to be a full participant in their own story. In an office where complaints are answered with the promise, "You'll come later to a specialist," and you are sent from door to door, you gradually lose not only hope of treatment, but the capacity to count yourself as an acting subject of your life. The causes of breakdowns are interconnected. Chronic pain depletes cognitive resources. Exhaustion reduces speech capabilities. The absence of comprehensible words breeds distrust among clinicians and loved ones. Distrust reinforces institutional barriers. It is one whole, and any localized attempt to fix only a single link will run into others. Elaine Scarry emphasized that intense pain destroys language. When the word disappears, so does the way to be heard, and social confirmation of the boundary collapses. Jean-Paul Sartre points to projectivity as the core of freedom. And when projectivity is blocked by a painful state, subjectivity loses a key elevator to ascent into the future. Another mode of breakdown is the normalization of suffering within culture. If suffering is recorded as an expected part of life for certain groups, it ceases to function as a signal of need and becomes background to which no one responds. Here the mechanism operates formally but loses function. The pain signal receives no correction and the boundary gradually thins. Political decisions that allocate resources turn this thinning into an institutional fact that justifies further disregard. The ultimate consequences of such a failure are multi-layered and long-term. Individually, it is a feeling of alienation from one's body and history, loss of voice in important decisions, loss of autonomy. Socially, it is the loss of collective responsibility and the redistribution of suffering toward those less protected. Arthur Schopenhauer reminded that suffering is the background of the will. The contemporary practical task is to prevent that background from devouring language and the capacities of will, and to give the person the means to manifest projective orientation again. Conclusion. Restoring the boundary requires a comprehensive approach. Work with the body and symptoms, restore narrative through language and therapeutic practices, change institutional algorithms of pain recognition, and create political mechanisms of recognition. This is not only a medical task. It is a task of ethics and law, pedagogy and public care. For you, this means keeping account of 4 indicators by which the state of the boundary can be assessed: clarity of bodily sensations, continuity of personal history, ability to express pain, and ability to act purposefully. Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Michel Foucault, Elaine Scarry, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Arthur Schopenhauer provide different tools of understanding, but the common thought is simple and strict. Where pain breaks the boundary, one must repair body, language, and institutions to return to the person the possibility of being themselves. How exactly does culture translate pain from a personal sensation into a manageable object that can be measured, regulated, and remade? Culture sets the tools by which pain takes shape. On the one hand, these are linguistic forms: words, metaphors, scales, diagnoses that fix and classify sensations. On the other hand, these are practices, rituals, clinical protocols, legal procedures, and educational techniques that prescribe when and how to express suffering. The third link is technologies: drugs, devices, methods of analgesia, and monitoring that change the very texture of experience. Together, these three types of tools create a network where suffering becomes an object of management, and the person becomes a subject whose expression is subject to interpretation and regulation. This network acts as a set of rules of perception. A pain scale turns heterogeneous sensations into a number. A clinical protocol indicates which signals require immediate intervention. Professional terminology gives the patient a repertoire for expression. As a result, a standardized language emerges that simplifies communication between body and system.
Michel Foucault showed how medical practices form not just methods, but ways of seeing and classifying people. What used to be a private cry becomes a clinical symptom and thus enters the field of power and care at once. Some techniques work through the disciplined routine of everyday life. Training in pain tolerance, fostered by family and professional norms, forces the body to get used to a certain level of discomfort and reconfigures thresholds of sensitivity. Other techniques make pain visible through documentation and certification. When suffering receives a code, a certificate, or an expert opinion, it acquires the right to resources and to legal recognition. Maurice Merleau-Ponty reminded us that the body is the primary support of meaning. Changes in practices of recording and care alter bodily awareness itself, because the body learns to respond to new signals and new interpretations of its sensations. There are techniques aimed at restoring the language of pain. Therapeutic methods and educational practices develop the vocabulary and metaphors to express experiences, help hold the link between sensation and meaning. Elaine Scarry emphasized that pain destroys language, and any cultural efforts that help the word return simultaneously restore the ability to demand help and influence the course of events. These techniques look not only at the symptom, but at the manner in which suffering becomes part of the stories of the person and the community. At the same time, many techniques dematerialize pain, translating it into manageable indicators. Monitoring physiological data, standardized scales, analgesia protocols create the illusion of control. Such reporting facilitates resource allocation and assessment of effectiveness, but in doing so, it forms a system where conformity to the norm becomes primary. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote about projectivity as a condition of freedom. When a person's project is evaluated through external metrics of pain, space for personal meaning and choice narrows, because decisions are made in terms of protocol compliance rather than the lived story. Analytically, one can distinguish a causal structural chain. The motivation for standardization arises from the need to manage risks and resources. Structure appears in the form of tools and rules that fix and order suffering. Consequences manifest in changes to the speech repertoire, experiences, and distribution of care. This triad shows that the technique of managing pain is not neutral. It redistributes attention, amplifies certain kinds of suffering, and renders others invisible. The impression of universal control creates calm in the system, but in human life, it manifests as a shift in norms and expectations.
The social results of such practices are complex and not always obvious. On the one hand, standards help systems respond faster and reduce harm. On the other hand, they tend to simplify and stigmatize complex experiences. The process of normalization makes pain part of the institution. When suffering fits expectations, it is serviced. When it does not fit, it risks being rejected. Michel Foucault called such procedures technologies of power, because through knowledge and classification, power acquires a way to organize people's lives on a large scale. There are also cultural devices that translate pain into an aesthetic or moral resource.
Religious and artistic practices frame suffering with meaning, insert it into narratives of victimhood or atonement, give symbolic roles. Such techniques can provide consolation and form, but they also fix expectations and patterns of expression. Maurice Merleau-Ponty reminded that sensation is inseparable from meaning. If culture offers ready-made meanings, the body begins to perceive pain through them and loses the ability to express the unique content of the experience. As a consequence, work with pain requires a combination of different techniques. Sometimes it is necessary to reduce intensity of sensations with pharmacology and physiotherapy. Sometimes it is necessary to develop language and rituals that allow one to tell one's story. Sometimes it is necessary to change institutional rules so that recognition and help reach those whose pain was previously out of view. Jean-Paul Sartre, Elaine Scarry, and Michel Foucault provide different instruments of critique and analysis, but the practical task remains one: to build management methods that do not erase the person under the mask of efficiency. The boundary of this approach is clear. Management techniques will not replace the experience, and one cannot abolish responsibility for distinctions in suffering with a simple set of rules. You can learn to recognize the mechanisms that shape pain and choose those practices that return voice and control to the person. Pain management must begin with respect for the body, continue with the development of language, and end with institutional changes so that suffering ceases to be merely a line item in a report and becomes part of who you are. The consequence is obvious and severe. When a person suffers, moral convictions go into an examining phase. Real obligations cease to be abstract and turn into a demand for action or a tacit evasion, which also has meaning. In the moment of pain, the limits of readiness to intervene, allocate resources, hear, and recognize become clear. Emmanuel Levinas proposed the idea that the face of the other invokes obligation, and pain serves as one of the most demanding interrogations of that face. As a result, those ideas about justice that previously existed on paper are tested by bodily need and by society's capacity to respond. The reason for this effect lies in the fact that suffering makes the moral situation practical. Pain advances concrete needs, articulated through a wound, a cry, sleeplessness, or limitation of action. This manifestation translates the ethical thesis into a set of proposals about what must be done now, who pays, and who listens. Martha Nussbaum treated compassion not as a momentary emotion, but as the basis of public response to human vulnerability. And it is precisely this practical orientation that establishes the causal link between experience and moral decision. When pain is visible and heard, it requires concrete steps from institutions and individuals, not philosophical reflections on virtue in a vacuum. Clarifying this picture requires saying something about the degree of reliability of such a test. Pain by itself does not deliver an unambiguous moral verdict.
The same pain can reveal nobility in one observer and indifference in another. It can prompt actions dictated by honor or decisions motivated by fear of cost. Additional conditions matter here. Who witnesses? Which social norms regulate the response? Which historical practices shape expectations of help?
Friedrich Nietzsche drew attention to the fact that suffering influences the evaluation of values, but does not determine them automatically. Understanding pain as a test presupposes that the test is administered in a context of relationships and institutions that can distort the result. A causal mechanistic clarification shows through which mechanisms pain operates as a test. First, the presence of a demand, a signal that mobilizes attention and action resources. Second, the transparency of suffering, the possibility to see and interpret it, determines whether it will prompt ethical mobilization. Third, social technologies of recognition and documentation decide whose pain has the right to a response. If a request remains without formal fixation, it is easily lost amid other demands. These mechanisms together explain why some sufferings become collective obligations, while others remain a private burden. Jean-Paul Sartre emphasized the role of conscience and choice in moral life, and here it becomes evident that society's choice to help or to ignore is itself an act that shapes moral reality. It is also necessary to clarify the boundaries of applicability of this idea. The test of ethics through pain works when there is the possibility to respond and when the response can be noticed and evaluated. In conditions where resources are completely exhausted or where institutional frames prohibit action, the very possibility of showing a moral stance may be limited, and the test result will become a symptom of systemic deficit rather than personal guilt. The ethical trial by suffering does not turn every observer into a judge without context.
It raises the question of distribution of responsibility between the individual and the structure, and pushes toward an assessment of how fairly society is organized. The clarification also concerns the internal dynamics of the person who suffers. Pain affects the ability to ask for help, to speak of need, and to trust others. When language is destroyed, as Elaine's scary wrote, the demand for help may be mute or fragmentary, and then the moral test is devalued from the start. This is a remark that suffering reveals not only readiness to respond, but also the conditions in which appeal is possible. For the test to be honest, it must take into account the asymmetry between the one who asks and the one who can answer. Otherwise, one may be evaluating not moral steadiness, but merely the lack of communication. The connection of this idea to the broader philosophy of pain consists in that the test of ethics through suffering unites the epistemic and normative sides of experience. Pain reports damage. It signals a boundary of capacity to act. At the same time, it tests what we are prepared to do with those signals in moral terms. In this sense, the idea of pain as a criterion of ethics links earlier theses about pain as a form of knowledge with theses about pain as a social factor. You can look at suffering as a source of information about the world and about the body, and simultaneously as a mirror of your ethical state. The practical consequence of this approach requires a reconfiguration of attention. If pain tests ethics, then conditions must be created under which the test will be fair. Expand linguistic resources for expressing need. Ensure institutions of recognition, and reduce barriers to response. These are not abstract programs, but concrete changes in healthcare, social protection, education, and everyday practices of mutual aid. Behavior that yesterday was considered a private matter becomes a public challenge because the results of the examination are visible to all. The philosophical task is to keep criteria clear and to respect the person in pain so that the testing of convictions does not become a method of excluding those who are less visible or less able to ask. The summary is simple. Pain, as a test of ethics, makes promises of justice and compassion visible. It requires that you and society answer not only in words, but in deeds. Understanding this binds philosophical reflection to practical responsibility and moves moral reasoning into the realm of concrete decisions. A man consents to a painful operation because he wants to restore hearing to a child from another donor. A woman takes blows to cover the escape of comrades on a dangerous night. These cases look similar externally. The body endures pain. Their meaning is different. In the first case, suffering has a purpose. It is directed toward a concrete result and is linked to intention. In the second, suffering plays the role of cover and becomes an instrument of someone's freedom. This private example shows that pain can be not just an experience, but an action in which the body functions as a means in the subject's intention. The conclusion from the example is simple. Distinguishing passive pain from pain as chosen sacrifice is necessary for understanding responsibility. Passivity is characterized by the absence of an intentional point of application of suffering toward a goal. Directed sacrifice involves a choice that relates suffering to a value or an obligation to others. This distinction affects moral evaluation and the duties that arise for those around. The definition needs clarification. Passive pain communicates damage and requires help. Directed sacrifice carries a meaningful project. It claims to change the situation through endurance. Intentionality here is understood as the capacity of suffering to be addressed to a person, an idea, a future. Friedrich Nietzsche explored how meaning becomes value through endured suffering and through a will that interprets its pain as a means for creation. This thought helps to see that sometimes suffering is transformed into an instrument of personal or collective will. Another aspect of intentionality is moral directionality, which links suffering to obligations to others. Emmanuel Levinas wrote about the face and the demand for a moral response. When suffering becomes the address of that demand, it evokes responsibility. The meaning here is not only that someone suffers, but that the suffering is aimed at a challenge, at a demand for change, and therefore the moral response ceases to be abstract. A question arises about the freedom to choose such suffering. Under what conditions can a person turn pain into a meaningful act, and when is the role of victim imposed on them? Jean-Paul Sartre reminded us of the link between freedom and choice, that accepting pain as a project is a form of existential self-definition. But freedom is always intersected by circumstances, and therefore the choice of suffering is rarely fully autonomous. A broad generalization. The intentionality of suffering is an indicator of how subjects give pain meaning and how communities interpret that meaning. When suffering declares a purpose, it ceases to be merely a signal of damage and becomes an act of communication, a political gesture, or a moral deed. Martha Nussbaum drew attention to the public function of compassion. If suffering is aimed at society, it demands an institutional response and changes the distribution of moral obligations. The presence of intention or its appearance creates practical consequences. Directed sacrifice receives recognition, symbolic meaning, sometimes political power. Passive pain more often remains marginal if there are no means to articulate it. This explains why some sufferings become part of collective memory in politics, while others remain invisible and unresponded to. The limits of this ideology are clear and important. Intention is hard to prove experimentally. Ostensible victimhood can be used for manipulation, and passive pain can be interpreted as a voluntary choice. Elaine Scarry emphasized the destruction of language in pain, and that limits the ability to historically fix intentions. When language is insufficient, motivation remains in doubt, and any conclusions about intent risk being mistaken. There are also institutional boundaries. Judging the directionality of pain through public reactions is possible only where verification procedures are available and where power does not distort interpretation. Where forces for recognition of suffering are centralized, the designation of victim is often predetermined by structure rather than the subject. This means that a theory of intentionality must take into account power and communication capacities. Finally, a moral boundary. Even if suffering is a conscious choice, ethics must assess the context of consent and the consequences for the vulnerable.
Accepting pain for an idea does not make it automatically righteous. Self-renunciation can reproduce hierarchies and serve as a cover for injustice. This caution is emphasized by thinkers who link freedom to responsibility and to respect for others. A direct conclusion to you. Notice when pain comes from passive harm and when it becomes an act directed at a goal. Evaluate the context, language, and power that shape this meaning. The distinction between accidental suffering and conscious sacrifice changes moral obligations, but it never relieves the need to verify facts and respect the person who endures. It is also important to remember the role of narrative. Suffering acquires directedness through narratives that create meaning and draw society's attention. Memory, testimony, and artistic practices can strengthen or undermine intention, making the victim a hero or an object of exploitation. Therefore, assessment should combine empathy with critical analysis. Recognize the voice of the sufferer, check its context, and limit the instrumentalization of pain. Practical consequences. Medical and legal institutions should develop sensitivity to intentions, not reducing everything to biomarkers, but also not trusting verbal statements alone without corroboration. Education and public debate must teach how to recognize manipulations, support those whose pain remains voiceless, and create mechanisms for responsible recognition of sacrifice. In the end, the question of the directionality of suffering returns us to a basic moral requirement: to respect human dignity, carefully distinguish motivations, and not use another's pain in service of one's own interests. This requires attention, procedures, and a continual readiness to doubt. Be attentive. The rule is clear and simple. When someone speaks about their pain, it is not just an expression of a condition. It is testimony. Pain claims truth about the world. It points to harm, to a violation of the boundaries of body or life. This claim is both epistemic and moral. Epistemic because suffering reports a fact that requires attention and correction. Moral because it addresses the responsibility of other people and institutions. Emmanuel Levinas believed that the presence of the suffering face itself elicits a response. This is not a declaration. It is a challenge that changes the allocation of duties in the community. Tension arises from the fact that testimony of pain is hard to control
and easily distorted. Pain is often without language or expressed fragmentarily. And here, Elaine Scarry's idea of the destruction of language in pain becomes crucial. When words are absent, interpretation fills the void, and interpretation is always political. The performative victim gains power if they are heard and recorded, while silent suffering remains invisible. Trust in accounts of pain fluctuates under the pressure of power interests, biases, and institutional verification mechanisms. This oscillation creates the risk of both underestimating suffering and using it as a tool for manipulation. Another tension is associated with epistemic limitations. The history of suffering is not like a physical experiment where conditions can be reproduced and independent witnesses obtained. The memory of trauma distorts facts. Cultural norms shape the language of complaint, and the social status of influential figures determines whose words are taken seriously.
Friedrich Nietzsche emphasized that interpretation of pain always passes through the will to power and through value frameworks that vary across communities. Because of this, testimony of pain is rarely, by itself, a sufficient basis for a final verdict. It requires corroboration, but corroboration cannot nullify human dignity and the right to respect. The political dimension makes the problem even sharper. Institutions are meant to record and evaluate accusations, but they themselves can be sources of bias. When pain becomes an instrument of politics, its status as evidence is transformed under the pressure of interests. Martha Nussbaum reminded us of compassion's public function, and that public recognition of suffering redistributes obligations. Therefore, it is important to distinguish legal interest in testing testimony from the ethical demand to respond to suffering. This duality gives rise to the need for specific approaches to what should count as testimony. Resolution begins with the principle of respect and the right to speak of pain. The first rule of practice is to take the mere presence of suffering as a reason for attention and action. This does not mean automatically abandoning doubt. It means that listening and an initial acknowledgement of the condition are obligatory steps. Listening must occur without humiliation and without an immediate need to prove manipulation. This creates space in which one can further work with facts without devaluing the person who suffers. Then, procedural means for verification and confirmation are needed. They include gathering independent witnesses, medical documentation, a history of events, and contextual investigation. Such procedures must protect the voice frequency of the weak, while being sufficient to detect abuses. Jean-Paul Sartre spoke of freedom as choice, and that choice must be accompanied by institutions that respect both the freedom to speak and the freedom to defend against falsification. Procedures do not replace compassion. They complement it with a structure that makes testimony more reliable. Ethical safeguards are important to prevent the instrumentalization of pain. Any verification should be combined with protection of dignity and the right to privacy. Institutions must develop standards that minimize secondary trauma in the verification process. This includes involvement of public advocates, training specialists to recognize cultural particularities in descriptions of pain, and mechanisms to address biases in belief. Introducing such norms reduces the risk that pain becomes merely a resource in political games. A practical set for you, the listener. First, do not shut down. Accept the account of pain as important information, then think about ways to corroborate it without humiliating the speaker. Consider social and institutional channels that can help: medical care, legal support, community organizations, and how they are structured.
Combine empathy with a drive for procedures that respect the person and simultaneously protect against manipulation. In the philosophical dimension, the bottom line is simple. Pain as testimony demands a double response: to be heard and to be checked. These two tasks are not mutually exclusive, they are complementary. Emmanuel Levinas teaches us responsibility before the face of the other. Elaine Scarry reminds us of the difficulties of expression. Friedrich Nietzsche and Jean-Paul Sartre point to the role of interpretation and freedom in the context of power.
The community's fundamental duty is to build practices that recognize the voice of suffering, protect it, and create fair mechanisms of verification. When you hear pain, act so that its recognition does not become a weapon, and so that verification does not deprive the person of dignity. This is the way to give testimony of pain the status it deserves. The desire to eliminate pain is often perceived as an act of mercy, as a purification of the experience through intervention. The paradox is that attempts to compensate for suffering can produce new forms of pain that can no longer be measured by previous metrics. This contrast between relief and the creation of new wounds sets the line of reflection about compensation mechanisms and their moral cost. The reason for the paradox lies in the fact that pain performs several functions simultaneously. It signals a violation, shapes identity, and regulates social obligations. When an external force intervenes, it alters these functions. Pharmacological suppression of pain removes anxiety and bodily signal, but at the same time deprives the person of the sign that demanded changes in the relationship to the world. Social compensations, such as monetary payments or support programs, sometimes remove visible harm but preserve the structure that produced the suffering. The mechanism is simple and cruel. Removing the symptom without transforming the conditions leads to displacement of burden and the emergence of new sources of degradation. How this manifests in practice and why it matters for ethics. Michel Foucault analyzed how institutions shape bodies and discipline behavior. Contemporary compensation practices create manageable forms of vulnerability that institutions can monitor and regulate, but do not always eliminate the cause. Martha Nussbaum emphasized the importance of human capabilities as a criterion of justice. If compensation returns a survivor to minimal function but deprives them of the possibility of a full life, then it is technically assistance, but ethically insufficient. The point is that compensation that does not touch structural prerequisites reproduces suffering in another form. A question arises about the limits of intervention and responsibility. How to distinguish compensation that restores autonomy from that which generates dependence or stigma? An analytical trio helps. Cause, structural vulnerability or traumatic event. Arrangement, set of measures aimed at eliminating consequences. Consequences, long-term reconstruction of people's lives, often with new barriers. The limits are obvious. If intervention is not accompanied by changes in social relations and status repair, it forms a cycle. This rule is not universal, but it serves as a guide when designing responses to suffering. The meaning of the paradox is best read through an example of pain management in medical practice. Heavy analgesia solves an acute problem, but may cause dependence and loss of control over the body. Surgeries that treat one pathology open the way to chronic complications and psychological trauma. Friedrich Nietzsche drew attention to how values are formed through suffering and overcoming. He showed that getting rid of suffering without a rethinking of values can weaken an individual's capacity for resistance and meaning-making. This is not a call to leave people in pain. It is a demand to see consequences deeper than ordinary logic of utility. The political side of compensation manifests in the fact that the distribution of resources makes some vulnerable
and others protected. When the system is aimed at correcting visible defects, it leaves unforeseen holes in the social fabric. Institutional compensations often follow the logic of risk accounting and cost minimization, and in that key, they are doomed to reproduce the very boundaries that generated suffering. Emmanuel Levinas taught that responsibility to the other must go beyond calculation. If compensatory policy remains calculative, it lacks depth of ethical responsibility. A practical takeaway for action is simple and demanding at once. Any compensation must combine three elements: restoration of bodily and psychological resilience, change of the conditions that produce the suffering, and restoration of status to the person harmed by pain. These elements do not align mechanically. They require political imagination and institutional courage. Rigid procedural frameworks sometimes protect against abuse, but without flexibility, they seal people into a new type of dependence. The philosophical fix here consists in the idea that the fight against pain is not limited to its elimination as a phenomenon. The struggle is a process in which not only the effectiveness of the means matters, but also its impact on the structure of people's lives. Ethical evaluation of compensations must look beyond immediate relief and consider whether the intervention changes power relations, risk distribution, and possibilities for self-determination.
The rightness of actions in genre is determined by whether they restore potentials for meaning and autonomy, or replace the original pain with systemic vulnerability. What you can do, hearing an account of pain or participating in compensatory practices. Ask about the long-term consequences of each act of help. Demand measures that return both function and status to the person. Support initiatives that link medical and social assistance with political work to remove causes. This is not a universal formula for instant solution, but it is a criterion that helps avoid turning compassion into a source of new suffering. A brief and exacting consolidation of thought. Compensation that removes a symptom but leaves the structure that produced the pain creates new pain. The fight against this paradox is the task of ethics and politics at the same time. Only the combination of respect for the sufferer, transformation of conditions, and restoration of status can turn relief into genuine healing. Pain outlines the subject, forming a line along which who I am and where I end is determined, and at the same time showing how this line intersects with other bodies and shared rules of life. Pain acts as a cartographer. It marks the limits of sensation, translating bodily state into a sign that can be read. This sign communicates not only about tissue damage or neural processes. It informs what possibilities for action remain to the person and what demands the world makes. The function of this sign is double. On the one hand, it orients self-knowledge, forcing revision of plans, work regimes, relationships. On the other hand, it mobilizes others, defining the circle of those who have the right to intervene and change the course of events. Through this sign, status is formed. The person becomes someone who needs help, whose voice must be heard, or someone who is bypassed. Status in turn converts into practices, medical, legal, everyday, that fix the boundary between what is considered internal and what is ascribed to the common concern. This marking of boundaries is linked to memory and identity. Experienced pain remains an imprint in the subjective chronicle and changes the line of personal history. It turns an event into a meaningful milestone, before and after. For a collective, pain performs an analogous role, becoming a point around which narratives, norms, expectations are formed. When a group shares suffering, it ceases to be a particularity and becomes part of the collective image,
delineating boundaries of inclusion and exclusion. Through such collective marking arise rituals of attention and practices of recognition, as well as mechanisms of distancing and stigma, all of which illustrate how painful experience moves from the plane of the bodily to the plane of the social. A scar on the skin can serve as a short illustration. It reminds the person of the event endured and signals to others. For some, the scar becomes a sign of experienced danger and a reason for sympathy. For others, it is a reason to maintain distance, designating an area where intervention seems justified, and an area where intervention is diametrically inappropriate. This simple bodily trace shows how pain becomes a marker of the boundaries of personality and relationships. There are mechanisms through which boundaries are fixed and transmitted. Norms of communication determine how the display of pain becomes acceptable, who may show suffering openly, and who is forced to hide.
Medical protocols record which problems deserve resources and attention. Legal procedures decide which pains are recognized as grounds for compensation and restoration. These mechanisms work as technical tools of boundary. They order, classify, and distribute fears and hopes associated with bodily vulnerability. Understanding this arrangement is important for assessing consequences of interventions. When boundaries are translated into bureaucracy, they take a form that can protect or cement vulnerability into a new status. The methodological boundary is obvious. Attention to pain as an outlining factor does not exhaust the causes of suffering and does not provide a universal recipe for action. Diseases, chronic conditions, and cultural differences break the simple picture. Sometimes, boundaries blur so much that it is impossible to draw a clear line between who deserves help and who is obliged to provide it. The impossibility of a common language of pain narratives makes recognition unstable. The limitation also lies in the fact that boundary marking itself can be an instrument of power. Whoever determines the criteria of inclusion gains the power to shape the fates of those whose pain is recognized. The limit of these observations is the recognition that the analysis of borders requires taking into account political and institutional contexts, not only the phenomenology of sensation. The connection with the thought of Maurice Merleau-Ponty helps deepen understanding. Maurice Merleau-Ponty emphasizes that the body is the primary point of entry into the world, and pain turns out to be precisely the experience that demonstrates this primacy. In Maurice Merleau-Ponty's terms, the boundaries of the subject are not a simple line on a map, but a field of mutual penetration of bodies and meanings, where the sensation of one becomes significance for another. Such a view translates the problem of boundaries from the plane of an abstract legal category into the living fabric of relationships and everyday gestures. Maurice Merleau-Ponty proposes thinking of the body as a meeting place of the visible and the perceived. And then, pain is visible not only as a signal of damage, but as a situation of mutual expectation and responsibility. This allows practices of assistance and recognition to be seen not as a set of technical acts, but as forms of relation to the presence of the other. If one follows these ideas, then every act connected with pain must be measured by the extent to which it preserves a person's capacity to be in the world, and not only eliminates symptoms. When you encounter someone's pain, this Maurice Merleau-Ponty perspective suggests seeing not only the trauma, but its contours in relation to the shared space of life. Listen to the borders that the body breaks through in communication, and pay attention to the institutions that solidify these borders. This attentiveness helps not only to recognize where the private ends and the public begins, but also to act so that borders serve not as devices of exclusion,
but as conditions of recognition and restoration. The problem is that pain sometimes calls for conversation and sometimes remains mute. It formulates a demand to be heard and receive a response, and yet it often meets either silence or an answer that turns it into a diagnosis, a statistic, or a moral judgment.
This problem can be described as a rupture between the addressee of suffering and the possibility of its acceptance. The body sends a signal, and social mechanisms sometimes do not know how to read it as an appeal to dialogue. As a result, suffering loses its communicative potential and remains an isolated phenomenon that does not enter into the ethical weave between people. The criterion by which one can judge whether pain has become a dialogical invitation consists of several interrelated signs. The first sign is the presence of addressivity. Pain is directed at another. It contains an expectation of reaction. The second is an explicit or implied demand for responsibility. The sufferer assumes that the other is at least capable of acknowledging their state, and at best, of participating in its alleviation. The third sign is transformational openness. The conversation about pain changes the situation, alters practices, norms, or relationships. The fourth sign is recognition of the speaker's autonomy. Listening does not annul the will and personality of the one who suffers. These signs form a functional scale. The more elements are present, the stronger the dialogical function of pain. If the criteria work, the consequences for relationships and society are deeper than they may seem at first. The presence of an addressed call and the receiving response moves the experience from the private to the public. In such a situation, suffering becomes a basis for responsibility, and practices of support form around it: attention, care, redistribution of resources. New meanings arise that are fixed in politics, healthcare, and everyday norms of behavior. At the personal level, a dialogue about pain helps restructure memory. Trauma loses the status of a mute shock and enters a narrative that gives the person the possibility to link past and future differently. When taking responsibility means not merely removing a symptom, but participating in the restoration of a person's capacity to be in the world, the conversation performs an ethical function, translating the pain signal into an articulated demand for justice. On the other hand, when the addressee does not receive an appropriate answer, the consequences form a different dynamic. Pain left unheard becomes a source of stigma, an object of private survival strategies, or an instrument of political control. Lack of recognition changes language. Instead of an appeal, there appears a justification. Instead of a response, instruction. Instead of responsibility, bureaucratic truncation. This affects social motives of trust and reduces people's readiness to open up to one another. You can observe how endless clarifying questions from doctors, procedural requirements, or moral judgments distance a person from the possibility of simply being heard. As a result, the dialogical potential of suffering diminishes, and its social productivity, the ability to serve as a basis for change, is lost. The limit of this idea is visible in its constraints. First, not every pain is convertible into words. There are states devoid of a language of address, and addresses that get lost in incompatible codes of cultures and institutions. Second, the very conditions of listening require power and resources. The possibility of being heard is distributed unevenly, and those who claim to be heard are those whose voice already possesses an infrastructure of recognition. Third, the dialogical model does not provide automatic recipes for political transformations. It indicates the direction of ethical responsibility, but does not guarantee the mechanisms of redistribution necessary for its realization. These limits force consideration of the institutional
and cultural contexts in which appeals are formed and acquire meaning. The legacy of Emmanuel Levinas is useful in this connection because he emphasizes the ethical primacy of response to the other. Emmanuel Levinas shows that the face of the other is a summons that precedes judgments and norms. In Emmanuel Levinas's terms, listening to pain appears as a basic form of responsibility, obligatory in its primacy and capable of transforming ordinary courses of life. At the same time, his thought stresses that this primacy of ethics does not remove problems of practical implementation. The response requires not only presence, but also the capacity to act in the world, to change structures that block recognition. The practical boundary calls for caution. When discussing the dialogicality of pain, one must watch that listening does not turn into consuming another's suffering for one's own moral satisfaction. And at the same time, acknowledge that ethical motivation by itself does not resolve institutional conflicts. For pain to truly become an invitation to speech and listening, skills must be formed. The ability to listen without immediate categorization. The readiness not to reduce meaning to a diagonal interpretation. The willingness to undertake long processes of restoration. This implies work with schools, medicine, law, and culture, so that the addressed event finds shelter in reliable practices of recognition.
I leave you with the thought that the dialogical function of pain is not an abstract ideal, but an instrument of everyday ethics. If you learn to notice the address in suffering and check it against criteria of responsibility and transformation, you will be able to participate in ensuring that pain passed through language does not dissolve in rules, but becomes an occasion for common change. Emmanuel Levinas reminds us that every response is a beginning of responsibility, and this simple stance serves as a guide for building a listening culture in a world where sufferings are heard more often than merely duplicated in reports. The philosophy of pain has reached a place where its tools cease to glue experience into a coherent picture, and this is the natural endpoint of any theory that tries to address what remains above all alive and immediate. I want to show how the thinking machine that takes on the work with suffering is arranged, where it is necessary, where it is dangerous, and what distortions it inevitably introduces if its limits are not acknowledged. The mechanism of the philosophy of pain consists in translating experience into concept, in extracting a function from experience, and in constructing norms that direct the response. This operation includes 3 steps: fixing the signal as significant, forming a criterion of evaluation, and deriving practices that change the mode of reaction. Such an approach is needed because without it, suffering often remains an unsystematic given with which it is difficult to act in social life. It provides grounds for responsibility, languages for describing trauma, protocols for assistance, and frameworks for political distribution of resources. Why this is necessary is not an abstraction. When you see that suffering receives a name, it ceases to be mere chance and becomes an object of intentional actions. Institutions arise that learn to listen and respond. Practices appear that allow people to link past and future. And an ethical obligation is formed that shapes social expectations. Philosophical reflection helps to think through what kind of response respects autonomy and what substitutes it with forms of control or exploitation. Where the mechanism breaks is visible by several signals. The first signal is the disappearance of living intention in favor of category. When suffering becomes a term in a protocol, its subtleties and context are lost. The second signal is the compression of complex experience into a measurable indicator. Statistics turn flesh into a number,
and the number serves for decisions that do not take individual meanings into account. The third signal is the institutional reproduction of pain as routine. Entrenched practices build a norm, and what once required exceptional ethics enters an algorithm, having lost its crisis character. The fourth signal is the aestheticization or romanticization of suffering, when the sense-making work of art or philosophy converts pain into a symbol and thereby relieves the moral duty of real intervention. The boundaries of this thought manifest as epistemic, ethical, and political limitations simultaneously. The epistemic boundary is connected to the fact that experience remains private and in some respects inaccessible to another's knowledge. Words and metaphors work, but they never give full coincidence with the intensity that occurs here and now in the body.
The ethical boundary is seen in that responsibility is not exhausted by attention. A response can cause harm if implemented through paternalism, through accelerated interventions without consent, or through instrumentalization of the sufferer to achieve other ends. The political boundary arises because resources and the right to recognition are distributed. A philosophical representation of pain matters only to the extent that it can be backed by practice and power. Distortions arise from habitual ways of processing information. Medicalization brings benefits when it opens access to help, but at the same time, it translates a moral demand into a checklist. Juridification gives protection, but fixes the history of suffering in documents that become instruments of control and criteria of admissibility of aid. Academization provides concepts and frameworks for discussion, but turns the voice into a quotation and weakens contact with living moral urgency. These processes are not neutral. They change what they describe and make this transformation part of the politics of suffering. There are also moments where philosophical work itself needs self-critique. We are inclined to think that analysis can resolve all contradictions, but analysis creates new questions. We form concepts that simplify complex experiences, and in this simplification, subtle distinctions that are vital for real help are lost. We speak of justice and responsibility, and at the same time, our terms become instruments for those who distribute goods and harms. Understanding these procedures helps not so much to find the final recipe as to develop caution in the application of theories. The boundaries of thought about pain also indicate applied limitations. Therapeutic technologies reduce suffering, but they create dependencies that require new resources and new ethical rules. Collective practices of solidarity create a sense of belonging, but they can miss individual trajectories of recovery. Memory transforms trauma into narrative, and narrative can fix a person in the role of victim, limiting possibilities for processing it. All this indicates that philosophy does not merely explain, it intervenes and changes the field in which recognition of pain becomes possible. A demand emerges for a more flexible philosophy. One must maintain respect for the incompleteness of knowledge while striving to build practices that reduce distortions. This means expanding the languages of description, introducing listening procedures that make room for autonomy, and working on institutions that can translate ethical calls into real changes without claiming exhaustive truth. It also means recognizing those cases where philosophical categorization is useful, and those cases where the best help is presence willing to endure uncertainty. Putting the picture together, imagine a few supporting thoughts. Suffering serves as a signal of cognition and ethical connection. Translating suffering into a category is necessary for organizing help and carries the risk of distortion at the same time. Language and institutions shape what is deemed worthy of attention.
Practices of response require respect for autonomy and readiness for long work. Philosophical reflection helps to see the traps of its own tools. These supports do not exhaust the tasks and do not promise simple solutions, but they indicate the direction of careful and responsible work with what remains one of the most complex phenomena of human existence.
The philosophy of pain reaches its limits, where its morals begin to replace living experience, and where the completeness of the answer substitutes for the task of supporting a person in their world. Reflection remains important, but its success is measured not by the completeness of explanation, but by how much it contributes to respect, restoration, and the fair distribution of responsibility. For giving you and me the illusions of simple answers, philosophy leaves space for practice, where word and action go side by side, where listening does not turn into consumption, and recognition does not remain a formality.